All right, welcome back to another rebuild with Red E. Today we're working on our customer's John Deere 1890 drill. It has 68 rows, and we're going to go ahead and do a rebuild on this and replace worn parts. And we'll show you failure pieces and also the wear pieces that are going on, and how to sequentially take this apart and putting it back together with new components. And so we're here to address a few of these wear areas, one of them being this closing wheel arm. And you can see how much slop is in that. And we're going to address that with new bushings, or actually new bearings in this case. And also down here on the firming wheel pivot is got a lot of slop in it as well. And then we're also looking at our gauge wheel slop. And so what we have here is some up and down movement with our gauge wheel. And in this case, it's got a lot of slop in the shifter plate and also down here in the main shaft or the depth shaft. And so when we replace this arm, we're going to take up this plate here, and then we're going to put a new shifter plate, new handle. That'll take up this plate that we have up in here, and hopefully we won't have this much up and down on the row here. In this case, we have a stuck shaft. A lot of times what you'll end up doing is beating that shaft through, and it ends up mushrooming this end. And what happens then is if you do get it to move, once you get it inside the spindle, that mushroom end actually just wedges in there hard, and you can't move it any further. Then rather than having to go through that whole painful process, we actually just go ahead and cut that shaft off right out of the start if it doesn't move on its own. So I did tap it over a little bit to give me a little bit of room to cut it, and I just use a 5-inch wheel on my grinder. We've used sawzalls, we've used band saws to also do this task, but the fastest, easiest way to do it seems to be the cutoff wheel. Just like that, we have it off, and then we'll go ahead and just pry this cap off. That'll expose our seal. So once I pry this seal off, we could go ahead and clean out around behind it, because you're going to need to get your socket on there once I get that seal off anyway. And then you can just go ahead and pry that seal off, and just going around the outsides and just working a little bit at a time. And then it should pop right off, just like that. So now we've got our spindle nut. And being that we're on the left-hand side of this drill, this is going to be a left-handed threaded spindle nut. And so when you're taking it off, it's going to be clockwise to take it off in this case. Just like that, we go ahead and pop that axle nut off, and we'll reuse that when we're going back in with a new spindle. And so now you can, as you can see, we can easily push the spindle, the complete spindle, out with the old shaft that's still in there. Now in this case, we're also replacing the spindle and also the shaft, and so this is the quickest way to take care of that. Where once you do take that shaft off, that this hub is actually nothing holding it up there except for the seal on the inside. And being that I'm not going into to changing any of the seals or anything like that, I want to make sure that I'm hanging on to this. And I'll put the shaft back in until I have a new shaft to go back in there. At this point, right, we talked about earlier when we took the axle nut off, that was a left-handed thread. So now here's the new spindle that we are going to install. So we just slide in our new spindle, and as you see, it comes out right there. Cleaned up our nut. All right, so we're going to be using an 1 11/16 socket. We're turning our torque wrench on and setting that to 190 foot-pounds. So we'll go on here until we start getting a good solid beep on our torque wrench. And that's how we know when we're torqued. So now what we have is depth shaft seal on the outside of the spindle nut. We do a couple of things here. So one of them being is we're going to use some seal glue on this here, because these have a tendency to spin on the nut. And also, while we're at it, we'll stake the nut a little bit with a chisel, going the long ways, and that'll give it a little bit extra bite on the seal when we go to put it on. So using the seal install tool that we've also have here, and it works really slick, fits exactly with this seal, and we can drive that seal on there. Just like that. So now we have the spindle in, and the nut's torqued up and it's ready to go. So we're going to end up putting in our new shafts. And so this particular drill, we're putting in new spindles and shafts, depth shafts, all the way. The beauty of this shaft is a few things. One of them being is we're going to be able to take care of the play that we had in the shaft to the depth arm. And the other part of this is, which is actually the biggest benefit, is this machine surface on the shaft. And what that does, it helps transfer that grease down the channel to where it gets better grease distribution, and it'll actually even get out into the seal area and come back around inside the spindle. When you order this piece, it has the grease zerk already installed, and we'll go ahead and remove that grease zerk before we put it into the cavity. What we like to do is actually get it greased up a little bit, and also grease the seals that are in the spindle and on the axle nut or the spindle nut. And just use a little bit of grease in each end here. Doesn't take a whole lot, otherwise it just pushes out. And one thing that we learned also is just to grease up this so the seal rather than greasing up the cavity on the shaft, because what will happen is it won't go all the way in once you start to put it on, because it'll seal up and actually create a high pressure there to keep it from going all the way in. And so we'll just take some of that grease, make sure we lube up our shaft a little bit, and then at the end we'll actually go ahead and grease through this grease the greaser. So you got to be careful when you get to this point. On the other side is a triple lip seal, and we don't want to cut that seal with the shaft, and so we just ease it through and then work it all the way on. And now that shaft is installed and on, and so what we would do next is actually install an arm with a washer and a new bolt. And locate the arm. So also in the kit, you got new hardware for this, and new bolt, new nut. Run the bolt up from the bottom, the nut on the top, and then we'll tighten that down with a wrench and an impact. So I'm turning the settings down so the torque isn't too much. And now that's tight. It's got a good pinch on the shaft and should keep any of that play from happening. One last piece of this is this grease zerk when we installed the depth shaft, and then we just make sure that we put it back in. So once we have our new arm in place, we can go ahead and install our new shifter plate and depth handle. Reuse the guard that goes in the front, and then slip our plate into place. So using these carriage bolts, we'll slide those through plate to the shifter plate, is it sits on the outside of the shifter plate when you put your carriage bolt through. There we go. So once I go to put my handle on, I'm using a new spring, a new handle, and sliding that down on there. Letting that settle down as far as I can, so you can see that the top of the shaft is exposed. Expose the threads there, so I can get that nut all the way down where it needs to be. Boom. So it's all the way down, and you see it's moving freely. And then I'll move the shifter plate up into place and put that rear carriage bolt in. Now I can put the rear one in. tighten it up. And again, like I mentioned earlier, so these are small bolts. They're only 5/16 bolts. And I've got my impact wrench turned down so the torque isn't too much to break that bolt. Okay, so now we've got that installed and we want to check the operation of our arm. And sometimes you might need to do a little bit of an adjustment on the arm and the placement coming through the shifter plate so it actually shifts and engages like it's supposed to. In this case, I do actually need to adjust it a little bit and move it in, and really is as simple as just giving it a little bit of tap and it should line it up like right there. So now it actually engages the shifter plate properly and it shifts smoothly.